Comfort does not ruin your life dramatically. That's why people trust it. It ruins you quietly, one easier decision at a time. To the new viewers beginning to recognize how modern life slowly weakens people without them noticing, welcome. And to the returning viewers already building a more disciplined, sovereign mind through awareness, restraint, and emotional control, welcome back. Turn on subtitles for this one. Some truths move too fast to fully catch the first time you hear them. Most people think danger feels intense, violent, obvious, but some of the most destructive things in life feel safe while they're happening. That's what makes comfort dangerous. Not physical comfort alone, psychological comfort, emotional comfort, the kind that slowly teaches your mind to avoid tension, avoid resistance, avoid uncertainty, avoid effort, avoid silence, avoid depth. And eventually, avoid growth itself. The terrifying part is you probably won't notice the damage immediately. Because comfort rarely destroys ambition overnight. It sedates it gradually. You can actually watch this happen in real time if you pay attention carefully. A person once obsessed with learning now spends 6 hours a day consuming short-form distraction. A man who once had discipline slowly begins organizing his life around convenience. Someone who once wanted greatness now just wants relief. And they usually don't even realize when the shift happened. That's how comfort operates. Quietly, not through force, through permission. You tell yourself you're resting. You tell yourself you deserve a break. You tell yourself life has been stressful lately. And sometimes that's true. But comfort becomes dangerous the moment relief turns into identity. Because then your nervous system begins rejecting anything difficult automatically. That's where mental decline starts. Not when life becomes hard. When your tolerance for discomfort becomes weak. Modern life encourages this weakness constantly. Food arrives instantly. Entertainment arrives instantly. Validation arrives instantly. Distraction arrives instantly. Even loneliness can now be interrupted within seconds. Human beings were never designed to have this much immediate escape available all the time. And the mind adapts faster than people realize. Every time discomfort appears and you instantly remove it, your brain learns something. Discomfort must be escaped immediately. That conditioning changes you slowly. Your attention span weakens, patience weakens, emotional endurance weakens, focus weakens, and eventually your ability to confront reality directly begins collapsing too. That's why many people now feel strangely exhausted by ordinary life. Not because life became impossible. Because their minds lost tolerance for friction. You can see it in small behaviors everywhere. People cannot watch a video without checking their phone. Cannot sit in silence without stimulation. Cannot focus deeply without emotional restlessness appearing. Cannot experience boredom without panic. And boredom matters more than people understand. Because boredom used to lead somewhere important. Reflection, creativity, self-confrontation. Now boredom gets interrupted instantly before the mind can deepen. Which means millions of people now live in a constant state of shallow mental movement. Always stimulated, rarely present, always consuming, rarely observing. And over time, this creates a strange psychological condition. People become emotionally dependent on comfort while simultaneously feeling empty inside it. That contradiction confuses them. They keep increasing stimulation but fulfillment keeps decreasing. More scrolling, less peace, more entertainment, less satisfaction, more comfort, less meaning. Because comfort and meaning are not the same thing. Meaning often requires resistance, effort, sacrifice, depth, responsibility. Things modern comfort tries to eliminate. That's why many people secretly feel disconnected from themselves now. They have convenience everywhere, but no inner solidity, no psychological sharpness, no real emotional endurance. No trust in themselves under pressure. And deep down, they know it. You can hear it in the way people talk when they think nobody is listening carefully. I just can't focus anymore. I feel mentally tired all the time. I know what I should do, but I don't do it. Those are not random complaints. They are symptoms. Symptoms of a mind slowly trained to prioritize comfort over alignment. That training begins earlier than most people realize. As children, many people are taught to avoid discomfort instead of understanding it. Avoid embarrassment, avoid failure, avoid emotional pain, avoid rejection, avoid uncertainty, and eventually avoidance itself becomes automatic. That's why some people spend their entire lives rearranging circumstances to avoid feeling uncomfortable for even a few minutes. But avoidance always charges interest later. That's the part comfort hides from you initially. Every avoided difficulty becomes a future weakness. Every escaped responsibility compounds quietly. Every moment you choose relief over growth trains the mind toward fragility. And fragile minds suffer more in reality, not less. Because reality does not adjust itself around your comfort forever. Eventually life confronts everyone. Loss arrives. Pressure arrives. Failure arrives. Responsibility arrives. And in those moments, comfort-conditioned minds often collapse quickly because they never built internal endurance. That's why some people panic under ordinary stress while others remain calm in chaos. Different conditioning. One person trained themselves to endure discomfort gradually over time. The other trained themselves to escape it immediately. The nervous system remembers both. This is why disciplined people often appear emotionally steadier than everyone else. Not because their lives are easier. Because they stopped treating discomfort like an emergency. That shift changes everything psychologically. Most people react to discomfort automatically. The feeling appears and behavior instantly follows. Stress appears. They escape. Boredom appears. They consume. Loneliness appears. They distract themselves. Anxiety appears. They numb it. Very few people actually pause long enough to observe what's happening internally before reacting. And that lack of awareness becomes dangerous. Because unconscious behavior repeated long enough becomes identity. Eventually people start saying things like, "That's just who I am. I've always been this way. No matter what I do, I go back." But identity is often just accumulated repetition protected by emotional familiarity. That means many people are not trapped by fate. They are trapped by conditioned comfort. And conditioned comfort can become invisible because society rewards it temporarily. Comfortable people are easier to manage. Easier to market to. Easier to distract. A person constantly seeking relief becomes highly predictable psychologically. That's one reason overstimulation became so normalized. A distracted mind questions less. A comfort-addicted mind tolerates more. A mentally exhausted population becomes easier to influence emotionally. Look around carefully. Most people are not truly resting anymore. They are escaping constantly. There's a difference. Real rest restores you. Escape temporarily interrupts awareness. One creates clarity afterward. The other creates dependency. You already know this feeling. That strange emptiness after hours of mindless consumption. The way time disappears without leaving anything meaningful behind. The low-level guilt. The subtle mental fog. The awareness that your attention was spent but nothing inside you became stronger. That feeling matters. Most people immediately drown it with more stimulation before it fully forms into thought. But if you stay with it long enough, you begin realizing something uncomfortable. Your comfort may be weakening your relationship with yourself. Because self-respect is deeply connected to observed behavior. Your mind watches what you repeatedly choose. It notices when you abandon difficult things quickly. It notices when you consistently choose convenience over growth. And eventually it adjusts its expectations downward. That's how internal standards quietly collapse. Not through one huge failure. Through tolerated weakness repeated casually. That's why dangerous comfort rarely feels dangerous in the beginning. It feels deserved, reasonable, normal. Until years pass and you realize your life became organized around avoiding tension instead of pursuing meaning. That realization hits people hard. Especially when they notice how much potential disappeared quietly while they were chasing relief. Potential loss creates a very specific kind of pain. Because deep down, people usually know when they participated in their own decline. Not consciously maybe, but internally, they know. You can see it in exhausted ambition. In unfinished goals. In constantly restarting self-improvement attempts. In people who consume endless motivational content while remaining behaviorally unchanged. They are emotionally attached to the idea of growth while psychologically addicted to comfort. That internal contradiction creates suffering. Because one part of them wants expansion, while another part keeps demanding safety. And safety becomes dangerous when it becomes your highest value. Think carefully about what happens when a person structures their life around minimizing discomfort. They avoid difficult conversations, avoid difficult work, avoid emotional honesty, avoid risk, avoid uncertainty, avoid discipline, Avoid responsibility. At first, life feels easier. But over time, capability shrinks. Confidence weakens. Identity softens. And eventually they begin feeling trapped inside a smaller version of themselves. Not because life imprisoned them. Because comfort slowly reduced their tolerance for challenge. That reduction happens so gradually most people barely notice until it affects major areas of life. Relationships become unstable because emotional discomfort feels unbearable. Ambition disappears because effort feels overwhelming. Focus collapses because the brain expects constant stimulation. Even basic discipline begins feeling emotionally exhausting. Then people start believing something is wrong with them fundamentally. But often the issue is conditioning, not incapability. A mind trained to avoid discomfort eventually interprets growth itself as threat. That's why the beginning of transformation often feels emotionally unnatural. You start doing things your nervous system resisted for years. Sitting in silence, focusing deeply, delaying gratification, staying disciplined after motivation disappears, facing reality directly without immediately escaping into distraction. At first, the mind protests aggressively. Not because you're failing, because the comfort-conditioned identity is losing control. And identity fights for survival even when it's destroying you. That's why many people sabotage progress right after momentum begins building. The new life feels unfamiliar. The old comfort still feels emotionally safe. So they unconsciously return to the patterns weakening them. This cycle repeats for years in some people. Progress, discomfort, retreat, progress, discomfort, collapse, until eventually they stop believing change is possible altogether. That hopelessness is one of comfort's final stages. Not physical laziness, psychological surrender, the belief that growth is harder than escape. And once someone fully accepts that belief, life starts shrinking rapidly. Their standards lower, their attention fragments, their emotional resilience weakens, and slowly, quietly, they begin adapting themselves downward instead of building upward. If this is exposing something you've privately noticed about yourself, press like on the video. Not for approval, as acknowledgement, and in the comments, write, "Comfort made me weak." Not as shame, as awareness, because awareness matters. The moment you clearly recognize the pattern, unconscious behavior begins losing some power over you. That's why many people avoid self-confrontation entirely. Honest awareness creates responsibility, and responsibility feels heavy when you realize how much of your life has been shaped by avoiding discomfort. But avoidance never removes reality. It delays confrontation while consequences quietly accumulate underneath. That's why some people suddenly feel lost at 30, 40, even 50 years old. Not because destruction happened instantly. Because years of comfort slowly disconnected them from depth, discipline, and direction. And modern culture rarely warns people about this honestly. It sells comfort as success, ease as intelligence, convenience as progress. But convenience without discipline often creates dependency. A person who cannot tolerate inconvenience becomes fragile quickly. And fragility creates fear. That's one reason anxiety increases in overstimulated societies. People become less psychologically prepared for uncertainty, tension, or resistance. Everything painful feels catastrophic because the mind lost familiarity with discomfort. But discomfort itself is not the enemy. Unconscious escape is. That distinction changes everything, because once you stop treating discomfort like danger, your entire relationship with life begins shifting. Now hard things stop feeling personally offensive. Now boredom becomes survivable. Now silence becomes informative instead of threatening. Now discipline becomes possible because your nervous system no longer panics every time effort feels uncomfortable. And that's where something important begins happening internally. Your mind starts becoming yours again. The moment your mind starts becoming yours again, comfort begins feeling different. You stop seeing it as harmless. You begin noticing how often it quietly asks you to betray yourself. Sleep a little longer. Delay it until tomorrow. Watch one more video. Avoid the conversation. Ignore the responsibility. Stay where it's familiar. None of these decisions seem life-changing individually. That's why people underestimate them. But your future is not built through dramatic moments most of the time. It's built through repeated emotional negotiations with comfort. And comfort is persuasive because it speaks in the language of protection. It tells you it's helping you recover, helping you relax, helping you avoid stress. Sometimes that's true. But comfort becomes dangerous the moment it starts replacing growth instead of supporting it. There's a reason many people feel mentally stuck despite having endless access to information. The problem is not lack of knowledge anymore. Most people already know what they should do. Sleep better, focus more, stop wasting time, exercise consistently, control impulses, reduce distraction. The issue is deeper. Their nervous system became attached to comfort patterns that oppose those goals. That attachment creates internal conflict. One part of the mind wants expansion. Another part wants emotional safety at all costs. And emotional safety often disguises itself as logic. That's why people can rationalize almost any self-destructive behavior if it provides immediate relief. I've had a hard week. I'll restart tomorrow. I just need a break. One day won't matter. The brain is incredibly intelligent at protecting comfort once comfort becomes identity. That's what most people fail to understand. You are not just fighting habits. You are fighting a version of yourself emotionally built around avoiding tension. That version of you does not disappear quietly. It negotiates, manipulates, delays, distracts, and it often sounds exactly like your own voice. That's why internal battles become exhausting for so many people. They don't realize the mind can produce convincing arguments against their own long-term interest. Especially during moments of discomfort. Watch human behavior carefully and you'll notice something strange. Many people would rather remain familiar than become free, even if familiarity is making them miserable. Because freedom requires responsibility, and responsibility removes excuses. Once you fully understand how your own comfort patterns weakened you, continuing those patterns becomes psychologically heavier. You can no longer pretend ignorance. That's uncomfortable. But discomfort is often where truth first enters. Most people spend their lives trying to remove discomfort instead of listening to what it's revealing. Loneliness might reveal emotional dependence. Boredom might reveal overstimulation. Restlessness might reveal lack of direction. Anxiety might reveal unresolved internal conflict. But modern life teaches people to suppress symptoms instantly instead of understanding causes deeply. Feel sad. Distract yourself. Feel uncertain. Consume something. Feel stressed. Escape into stimulation. Feel empty. Seek dopamine. This creates a society emotionally trained to avoid inward observation. And without inward observation, people slowly lose contact with themselves. That's why some individuals now feel strangely disconnected from life despite constant stimulation surrounding them. Nothing fully lands anymore. Nothing fully satisfies. Everything feels temporary, shallow, fast. Because comfort culture trains people toward interruption, not depth. Depth requires endurance. Think about what deep relationships require. Patience, vulnerability, discomfort, conflict resolution, sacrifice. What does meaningful work require? Focus, repetition, frustration tolerance, delayed gratification. What does mastery require? Boredom resistance, consistency, humility, persistence. Almost everything meaningful in life demands qualities comfort addiction weakens. That's why dangerous comfort doesn't just affect productivity. It affects identity itself. A person who repeatedly avoids discomfort slowly becomes less capable of handling reality directly. Not weaker physically necessarily, psychologically weaker, emotionally reactive, mentally scattered, dependent on stimulation, unable to remain steady under pressure. And this shift happens gradually enough that many people normalize it completely. Look around carefully. Emotional impulsiveness is normal now. Constant distraction is normal now. Mental exhaustion is normal now. People wearing stress like identity. People needing noise constantly. People unable to sit still for 10 minutes without reaching for a device. And because these behaviors became common, people stopped recognizing them as warning signs. But common dysfunction still destroys lives. That's one of the most dangerous things about collective decline. When enough people deteriorate together, weakness starts looking normal. Then disciplined individuals appear extreme simply because they retained basic self-control. That tells you something important about modern culture. A person protecting their attention now seems unusual. A person resisting endless stimulation now seems intense. A person maintaining standards now seems rigid. Why? Because comfort became the default social operating system. And anything opposing comfort begins feeling unnatural to comfort-conditioned minds. This is why many people initially resist disciplined environments. Silence feels uncomfortable. Structure feels restrictive. Accountability feels threatening. Not because these things are harmful. Because they expose how dependent the person became on emotional escape. That exposure creates friction. And friction reveals reality. You can observe this clearly when someone tries to change their life seriously for the first time. At first they feel motivated, focused, clear. Then discomfort appears. The routines become repetitive. The excitement fades. The resistance begins. And suddenly the old comforts start calling louder than ever. That's not random. The brain is attempting to restore familiarity. People often interpret this stage incorrectly. They think losing excitement means something is wrong. But sustainable discipline was never supposed to feel constantly exciting. That expectation itself comes from overstimulation. A comfort-conditioned brain expects emotional reward immediately and consistently. Reality doesn't work that way. Real growth often feels quiet, repetitive, unglamorous, and emotionally neutral much of the time. That truth disappoints people addicted to intensity. They want transformation to feel dramatic constantly. But most meaningful change happens in ordinary moments where nothing emotionally exciting is happening at all. You wake up, do the work, stay aligned, repeat. That simplicity frustrates people who unconsciously crave emotional entertainment more than progress. And comfort culture encourages this craving constantly. Everything must be stimulating now. Fast, intense, emotionally charged. Even self-improvement became entertainment for many people. They consume motivation endlessly instead of building structure quietly. Because consuming inspiration feels easier than confronting discipline. One creates emotional excitement temporarily. The other requires behavioral change consistently. Huge difference. That's why people can binge self-improvement content for years while remaining internally unchanged. They became addicted to the feeling of growth instead of growth itself. And comfort loves this. Because fantasy progress allows the person to feel productive without enduring real discomfort. This is one of the most sophisticated traps modern comfort creates. Pseudo-growth. The illusion of transformation without actual sacrifice. You watch videos, read books, think deeply, talk about goals, but behavior remains mostly untouched. Why? Because true transformation threatens comfort directly. It demands reduced escape, reduced distraction, reduced emotional indulgence. And many people unconsciously resist this because comfort has become their emotional protection system. That protection system often forms during painful periods too. This is important. Not every comfort pattern comes from laziness. Some come from unresolved emotional pain. A person overstimulates themselves because silence feels unbearable. A person constantly consumes because stillness exposes loneliness. A person endlessly scrolls because stopping would force self-confrontation. Understanding this matters because people cannot sustainably change through self-hatred. But they also cannot change while endlessly excusing themselves. There must be honesty. Calm honesty. The kind that observes patterns without theatrics. You do not need to call yourself broken. You need to recognize what repeated comfort seeking has conditioned into your nervous system. That awareness creates choice. Without awareness, behavior stays automatic. And automatic behavior shapes destiny quietly. One of the saddest things to watch is a person slowly lowering their standards to match their comfort addictions. They stop expecting depth from themselves. Stop expecting discipline. Stop expecting focus. Eventually they become surprised by effort itself. That psychological decline affects everything. Relationships become shallow because difficult emotional conversations are avoided. Dreams shrink because ambition feels exhausting. Attention collapses because stimulation becomes constant. Even personality changes. The person becomes more irritable, more reactive, more mentally fragmented. Not because they're evil, because the nervous system became overloaded and under-disciplined simultaneously. Modern comfort creates this paradox often. People are overstimulated yet underdeveloped. Constant input, minimal internal growth. And eventually this creates emotional emptiness difficult to explain. Because human beings need more than pleasure. They need meaning, direction, self-respect, challenge. But challenge disappears when comfort becomes the highest priority. That's why some people secretly admire disciplined individuals even while criticizing them publicly. Deep down, they recognize strength. Not loud strength, quiet strength. The ability to resist impulses. Remain focused. Endure discomfort calmly. Maintain standards consistently. These qualities trigger something ancient inside people because they represent internal order. And internal order feels rare now. Most minds are chaotic, pulled constantly between distraction, emotion, stimulation, insecurity, comparison, entertainment, and escape. A chaotic mind struggles to create a stable life. Because external reality eventually reflects internal condition. Scattered attention creates scattered living. Weak discipline creates unstable direction. Emotional impulsiveness creates avoidable suffering. Everything connects. That's why dangerous comfort is not merely a lifestyle issue. It's psychological conditioning. The more you obey comfort automatically, the weaker your relationship with conscious choice becomes. Eventually your moods begin controlling your behavior completely. And mood-based living creates instability because emotions fluctuate constantly. One day motivated, next day collapsed. 1 week disciplined, next week escaping again. This inconsistency damages something deeper than productivity. It damages self-trust. And self-trust is one of the most important psychological assets a human being can possess. Without self-trust, even simple goals feel heavy because internally you no longer believe your own promises fully. You say you'll change. Part of your mind quietly doubts you already. Why? Evidence. The nervous system remembers repetition. If you repeatedly abandoned yourself in the past, the mind expects abandonment again. That expectation creates hidden resistance during transformation. People think they lack motivation. Often they lack internal credibility. This is why rebuilding discipline starts with smaller moments than most people expect. Not dramatic reinventions. Tiny proofs. Keeping your word in ordinary situations. Remaining focused when distraction is available. Sitting with discomfort without immediately escaping. Finishing difficult things quietly. These moments look insignificant externally. Internally, they rebuild authority. And authority over yourself changes your entire experience of life. You stop feeling dragged around by every impulse, every craving, every emotional fluctuation. That stability creates peace deeper than pleasure ever could. Because pleasure fades quickly, but self-respect creates lasting internal calm. If this video is making you recognize how comfort has been silently shaping your mind, subscribe and strengthen a mindset built on discipline, awareness, emotional control, and psychological clarity instead of endless escape. Share this with someone who feels mentally exhausted but doesn't yet understand why. Because most people think they are tired from doing too much. Many are actually tired from avoiding too much. Avoiding tension, avoiding stillness, avoiding truth, avoiding themselves. And avoidance drains life force slowly. That's why some people feel exhausted after entire days of comfort. No real challenge, no meaningful struggle, yet mentally depleted. Because constant stimulation without depth fragments the mind. A fragmented mind cannot rest deeply. It remains agitated beneath the surface, always needing more input, more interruption, more relief. That cycle continues until something finally breaks the illusion. Sometimes heartbreak. Sometimes failure, sometimes humiliation, sometimes simply waking up one day and realizing years disappeared while comfort slowly emptied your potential. That moment changes people, not immediately, but permanently. Because once you fully see what comfort has been costing you, you can never completely unsee it again. There is a specific moment most people remember, even if they don't talk about it. Not a dramatic failure, not a major loss. Just a quiet realization that something fundamental has been slipping away for a long time without resistance. It usually happens in silence, late at night, or during a pause in distraction, when the mind is no longer overstimulated enough to avoid itself. In that moment, comfort stops feeling innocent. It starts feeling like evidence. Evidence of time misused, evidence of attention scattered, evidence of promises repeatedly postponed. And what makes it uncomfortable is not the past itself. It's the recognition that nothing forced those choices. They were chosen, repeatedly. Comfort doesn't conquer people by force. It persuades them through relief. That's what makes it so effective psychologically. It never tells you to destroy your future. It just asks you to delay effort, to postpone discomfort, to choose ease one more time. And one more time becomes a pattern. A pattern becomes identity. And identity becomes destiny. Most people never notice this progression because it doesn't feel like decline while it's happening. It feels like living. But if you examine it carefully, you'll notice something unsettling. Comfort rarely leaves you stronger after repeated exposure. It leaves you dependent on its presence. Dependent on stimulation. Dependent on distraction. Dependent on emotional escape. That dependency is subtle at first. You don't feel addicted. You feel normal. But remove comfort suddenly and something interesting happens. Restlessness appears. Mental noise increases. Emotional discomfort rises quickly. Not because something is wrong with you. Because your nervous system was conditioned to require constant interruption. That's when people often realize how fragile their focus actually is. They cannot sit still, cannot think deeply, cannot remain with one thought for long without reaching for something external. And they interpret that as personality. I just can't focus. I've always been like this. But focus is not personality. It is trained tolerance. And tolerance is built through controlled discomfort, not avoidance. That's a truth many people resist because it places responsibility back on behavior. Modern comfort culture quietly shifts responsibility outward. Blame the environment. Blame attention spans. Blame technology. Blame society. There is truth in all of that. But it misses something critical. Even in the same environment, some people remain disciplined. Even with the same devices, some people maintain focus. Even under the same pressures, some people develop restraint. The difference is not exposure. It is response. And response is where identity is formed. Every time you respond to discomfort with escape, you reinforce a psychological pathway. Every time you respond with presence, you weaken that dependency. This is why transformation often feels repetitive and unglamorous. You are not discovering something new every day. You are interrupting something old repeatedly. Comfort habits are deeply automatic. They don't disappear through understanding alone. They weaken through interruption. That's why insight without behavioral change feels incomplete. You can understand your patterns perfectly and still repeat them. Because understanding does not automatically override conditioning. Only repetition in the opposite direction does. This is where most people become stuck. They think awareness should be enough. But awareness without resistance becomes passive observation. Real change begins when awareness turns into interruption. You feel the urge, you notice it, and you do not immediately obey it. That small gap is everything. In that gap, identity becomes flexible. Without that gap, identity remains automatic. Most people never experience that gap consistently. They move directly from impulse to action, stimulus to response, emotion to behavior. No pause, no separation, which means no real choice. And a life without choice feels like fate, even when it is self-created. That's why many people feel trapped in cycles they cannot explain. They are not trapped by external conditions alone. They are trapped by internal immediacy. Everything is acted upon too quickly to be evaluated. And comfort thrives in immediacy. It removes friction. It removes delay. It removes reflection. But reflection is where control begins. Without reflection, behavior is reaction. And reaction is predictable. That's why some people feel like they keep ending up in the same place, despite wanting change. They are not making new decisions. They are repeating old responses in slightly different contexts. Same pattern, different setting, different time, same outcome. And over time, that repetition creates a sense of inevitability. But inevitability is often just repetition mistaken for destiny. There is nothing mystical about it. It is behavioral conditioning reinforced long enough to feel permanent. Comfort strengthens this conditioning because it rewards repetition that avoids tension. Every time you choose ease over effort, the nervous system receives reinforcement. Relief. Instant reduction of discomfort. That relief becomes psychologically addictive not because it is pleasurable in a dramatic sense, but because it removes pressure immediately. And the mind is deeply sensitive to pressure removal, especially when pressure is frequent. So gradually, comfort becomes the default solution for almost everything. Stress appears. Comfort responds. Boredom appears. Comfort responds. Uncertainty appears. Comfort responds. And slowly, the mind stops developing alternative responses. It loses range. It loses flexibility. It loses resilience, which is why later in life, even small challenges can feel disproportionately heavy. Not because the challenge is extreme. Because the internal capacity was never developed. That's the hidden cost, not failure. Reduced capacity. a narrowing of what the mind can tolerate without escape. And once capacity shrinks, life begins feeling heavier than it objectively is. Simple tasks feel exhausting. Basic discipline feels overwhelming. Ordinary responsibility feels draining, because the nervous system is no longer trained for sustained discomfort. At that point, comfort doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like necessity, and that is where many people quietly settle. Not in one moment, but through gradual psychological narrowing. However, something important remains true. Capacity can be rebuilt, but it requires reversing the exact mechanism that created the limitation. You cannot rebuild focus while constantly interrupting it. You cannot rebuild discipline while consistently avoiding discomfort. You cannot rebuild resilience while automatically escaping pressure. Rebuilding requires exposure, controlled, repeated exposure to what you previously avoided. Not extremes. Consistency. This is where most transformation begins to feel counterintuitive. Because people expect progress to feel increasingly comfortable. In reality, early progress often feels increasingly uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong. Because sensitivity is returning. You are becoming aware again of what you previously numbed. You start noticing restlessness you ignored before. You start feeling impulses more clearly. You start seeing distraction patterns more clearly. And at first, that awareness can feel destabilizing. But it is actually a sign of recovery. Because numbness is not strength. It is reduced perception. And reduced perception feels easier but creates long-term weakness. Awareness feels uncomfortable but creates long-term control. That is the trade-off most people avoid acknowledging. They choose immediate emotional ease over long-term psychological strength. And comfort rewards that choice instantly, which reinforces it again. This loop continues until something interrupts it. Sometimes external pressure forces it. Sometimes internal dissatisfaction reaches a threshold. Sometimes a person simply becomes tired of repeating the same patterns without progress. But interruption is always required for change. Without interruption, comfort remains the governing system. And under comfort, the mind rarely develops beyond its current limitations. This is why many people feel like they are capable of more, yet consistently behave below their potential. They are not missing intelligence. They are missing interruption of automatic comfort responses. That distinction is crucial, because it means the problem is not fixed identity. It is modifiable conditioning, and conditioning responds to deliberate resistance. Every time you delay an impulse, even briefly, you create structural change. Not emotional change, structural. You are reshaping what your brain expects from you. And expectation is powerful, because the brain does not simply record what you do. It predicts what you will do next. If prediction changes, behavior begins to shift automatically over time. That is how identity evolves. Slowly, through accumulated deviation from old patterns. And eventually, a point arrives where comfort no longer feels like authority. It feels like noise, an option, not a command, a suggestion, not a necessity. That shift is subtle but profound. Because once comfort loses authority, you regain internal hierarchy. Now impulses exist, but they do not govern. You observe them instead of obeying them. And that separation is where psychological freedom begins. Not external freedom, internal structure, the ability to remain aligned even when discomfort appears. That is what most people are actually searching for when they say they want discipline. Not restriction, stability. Because without stability, even success feels unstable. With stability, even difficulty feels manageable. And comfort, when understood clearly, stops being an enemy. It becomes something else, a test of whether you are still controlled by it. A signal, not a guide. And the more clearly you see that, the less power it has over your direction. But understanding alone is not enough. The real question is always the same. What do you do when comfort appears again, in its most persuasive form? That answer will determine the next version of your mind. There is a moment that separates people who understand discipline from people who actually live it. It is not when they feel motivated. It is not when they make promises. It is not when they plan change. It is when comfort appears again, and nothing inside them automatically obeys it. That moment feels almost insignificant from the outside. No applause, no recognition, no visible transformation, just a private decision. But internally, something structural shifts. Because every time you refuse automatic comfort, You are rewriting what your mind believes about you. Not emotionally, physiologically. The brain updates expectations based on repetition, not intention. And once enough interruptions happen to old patterns, something subtle begins dissolving. The assumption that impulses must be followed immediately. Most people never reach this stage because they never stay consistent long enough to break the automatic chain. They interrupt once, maybe twice, then return to old patterns under stress. And stress is where comfort becomes most persuasive. Because under stress, the mind reduces long-term thinking and increases emotional urgency. That is when people relapse into habits they thought they had outgrown. Not because they were weak. Because their training was incomplete. They never built response under pressure. Only intention during calm moments. But real identity is not formed in calm. It is revealed under pressure. And pressure always exposes what comfort trained. If comfort trained escape, pressure triggers escape. If comfort trained avoidance, pressure triggers avoidance. If comfort trained discipline, pressure triggers structure. This is why repetition matters more than insight. Because repetition is what survives emotional variation. At some point, you begin noticing something important. The urge still appears, but it feels less authoritative. It is present, but not commanding. It tries to pull you toward automatic behavior. But something inside you pauses first. That pause is not hesitation. It is awareness. And awareness is the beginning of control. Most people misunderstand control as suppression. But real control is not suppression of urges. It is separation from them. The ability to observe without immediately becoming the behavior. That separation changes everything. Because once you are no longer identical with every impulse, choice becomes real again. And when choice becomes real, identity becomes flexible. You are no longer forced into automatic patterns. You can redirect. You can interrupt. You can remain. You can endure. You can decide. And that capacity is what comfort slowly weakens in most people without them noticing. Not by removing choice directly, but by reducing the gap where choice exists. Comfort collapses that gap through immediacy. Discipline expands it through delay. Even a few seconds of delay between impulse and action begins altering internal structure. In that space, something new forms. Observation. And observation is the foundation of mastery over the self. Because you cannot change what you cannot see clearly. Most people are not fully aware of their behavioral triggers. They react before recognizing them. Stress appears. Escape follows. Emotion rises. Reaction happens. No observation. No interruption. No awareness. Just pattern execution. But once awareness begins entering that sequence, something unusual happens. The pattern stops feeling automatic. It starts feeling optional. And once something feels optional, power shifts. This is why disciplined individuals often appear calmer during moments that destabilize others. Not because they feel less. Because they no longer identify immediately with what they feel. That distinction is everything. Feelings still arise. Urges still appear. Discomfort still exists. But identity is no longer fused with them. That fusion is what creates most suffering. I feel it, therefore I must act on it. That assumption runs silently in most minds. But it is false. Feelings are signals, not commands. Urges are events, not instructions. Comfort is a sensation, not authority. Once that is understood deeply, behavior becomes less reactive. And life becomes less chaotic internally. But there is a cost to reaching this point. You begin seeing how often you previously abandoned yourself. Not dramatically, subtly, quietly, in ordinary decisions. And that awareness can feel uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of innocence. You realize most of your limitations were not imposed externally. They were reinforced internally through repeated acceptance of comfort. That realization is heavy for some people. Because it places responsibility directly in their hands. But responsibility is also where power returns. As long as something external is blamed, control remains external. Once ownership is accepted, control begins shifting inward. That is where transformation begins to stabilize. Not in motivation, not in emotion, in ownership. Ownership of behavior, ownership of attention, ownership of response. This is why discipline feels less like restriction over time and more like alignment. You are no longer negotiating with yourself constantly. You are acting in accordance with a chosen direction rather than fluctuating states. That reduces internal noise significantly. And internal noise is one of the most exhausting aspects of modern life. Constant indecision, constant distraction, constant emotional drift, constant fragmentation of attention. A mind operating under constant fragmentation cannot feel grounded. Because grounding requires sustained focus on something stable. But comfort culture fragments attention intentionally through endless options, endless stimulation, endless interruption. So the mind becomes trained to move rapidly between inputs without ever settling deeply into one. That creates a subtle but persistent instability. Even when nothing is wrong externally, the internal system feels unsettled. That is why many people cannot relax fully anymore. Even during rest, their mind remains partially active elsewhere. Scanning, checking, switching, consuming, avoiding stillness. But stillness is where psychological structure is rebuilt. Because only in stillness do automatic patterns become visible. And only what becomes visible can be changed. This is why discomfort is not the enemy of growth. It is the entry point to awareness. Without discomfort, there is no signal that something is misaligned. Comfort hides misalignment by temporarily reducing tension. But reducing tension is not the same as solving the cause. So the cycle repeats, until awareness interrupts it. At a certain point, you begin to notice a shift. You are not as controlled by impulses as before. There is space, even small, between feeling and action. And in that space, something new becomes possible. Deliberate behavior, not perfect behavior. Deliberate behavior. That distinction is important. Perfection is not the goal. Conscious direction is. Because perfection creates pressure. But direction creates stability. And stability is what eventually builds identity strength. As this continues, comfort begins losing its automatic authority. It still appears. It still offers relief. But it no longer decides for you. You recognize its pattern. You recognize its timing. You recognize its promises. And slowly, its influence weakens. Not through resistance alone, through recognition and repetition of alternative responses. This is where real transformation becomes visible internally. Not in dramatic lifestyle changes immediately, but in psychological consistency. You stop feeling pulled in multiple directions constantly. You start feeling anchored, even under stress, even under temptation, even under uncertainty. That anchoring is what most people are unconsciously searching for when they chase discipline. Not control over others, control over internal fragmentation. Because fragmented minds suffer, not loudly at first, quietly, through exhaustion, through indecision, through lack of direction, through emotional instability. But once internal structure forms, something changes. Life feels less reactive, less chaotic, less draining. Not because challenges disappear, but because you are no longer abandoning yourself during them. That is the real shift. And it begins with a simple realization. Comfort is not neutral. It is shaping your mind continuously. The only question is whether you are aware of how. And whether you are still willing to obey it automatically. Because the moment you stop obeying it without awareness, your future self stops being an idea, and starts becoming a direction you are already living toward. From here, nothing external needs to change immediately. Only the next decision, and the one after that, and the one after that, until eventually, comfort is no longer the quiet force guiding your life. It becomes something you can see, something you can interrupt, something you can rise above. And in that space, your mind finally starts returning to you. Not as impulse, not as reaction, but as something you can actually lead.